Hey, what's up everybody? It's Izzy from PowerliftingToWin, and in today's program review we're going to be discussing the Westside barbell method, also known as the Conjugate method. Now, Louis Simmons is the developer and originator of the Westside method. As far as I know, Westside Barbell, the gym, has produced more multiply powerlifting champions than any other single gym in the history of the sport of powerlifting. To this day, the Westside Barbell Book of Methods is one of the most fascinating reads on powerlifting that I have ever had the chance to go through. Now, it's also one of the most contradictory and somewhat incoherent reads, but that's a topic for later on in the video. If you guys want a copy of the Westside Barbell Book of Methods, I'm going to go ahead and put a link to it in the description box. As you might expect, on the back of success like a gym that produces more multiply champions than any other gym in history, the Westside method really rose to prominence during the multiply movement. There was a period of time where the vast majority of American powerlifters were either using Westside or attempting to do so. Times have changed, and due to the raw movement, Westside has really fallen out of favor. And in the rest of this video, we're going to take a look at the factors that have contributed to that. Let's talk a little bit about how Westside got started. So for those of you guys who don't know, the original Westside gym was actually based out of Culver City, California. And Louis Simmons was really influenced by this group of lifters. They were actually the group of lifters that popularized the board press and the box squat. Louis Simmons wasn't the first guy to use that. Now, because these group of guys influenced Louis so much, when he started his own gym, he unofficially called it Westside Barbell. Eventually the name stuck and it became official. The methods employed at Louis Simmons' Westside Barbell were developed both as a collection of principles from Eastern Bloc sports science and organically through experimentation. To this day, Westside is essentially a giant laboratory for Louis to test his ideas on a litany of his different athletes. A lot of the method was developed evolutionarily based on what was working and what wasn't. And on the other hand, Westside is based, like I said, on primarily three Eastern Bloc science sources. The first is the Bulgarian method, the second is the Russian Conjugate method, and the third is A.S. Prilepin's table, which gives you optimal sets and reps for both increasing speed and strength in Olympic weightlifters. Let's start off with where Westside draws from the Bulgarian system. So for those of you who don't know, Bulgaria, despite being a small, tiny, economically depressed country, produced more weightlifting champions than any other single country during its dominance. Coach Abadjiev, I'm sorry I'm probably butchering this guy's name, was famous because what he would have his lifters do is only a handful of exercises. They would only front squat, back squat, clean, jerk, snatch. And what they would do is work up to a max multiple times a day. So essentially, all these guys did to improve for their sport was play their sport. This idea of maxing so frequently and constantly working heavy was very appealing to Louis. Ironically, the Bulgarian method works because of its extreme specificity. It's literally as far towards the spectrum of specificity as you can get. It'd be like if a powerlifter just did a powerlifting meet every single time he trained. Now, Louis ironically took this and mixed it with the Russian Conjugate system, which he learned about from the Dynamo Weightlifting Club. Now, the Dynamo Weightlifting Club had a veritable stable of special exercises to choose from. Rather than only doing 5 or 6, they had upwards of 45, and Louis claims that most of their lifters wanted even more options. So, Louis essentially combined the Bulgarian method with the Russian Conjugate system in order to come up with what is now known as the max effort method. And the max effort method in Westside is essentially where you max out on tons of different exercise variations. And unlike the Dynamo Club, Westside doesn't involve 45 variations. Westside involves hundreds, if not thousands of variations on max effort day. Citing both the differences between training between powerlifting and weightlifting and the high burnout rate of the Bulgarian system, what Louis decided was that you shouldn't be maxing out every single training session. So we took this weird combination of the Bulgarian system and Russian Conjugate and added work by A.S. Prilepin for the second training day during the program. So for those of you unfamiliar with Prilipin's chart, as it's commonly known, it's basically a table that was designed by observing highly qualified weightlifters. And the table gives you sets and reps that help a lifter maintain optimal technique, speed, while still developing strength. Now obviously the table is somewhat limited because it was developed for Olympic weightlifters, but nonetheless it was developed with the idea of maintaining maximal bar speed technique while simultaneously developing strength. So Louis took the ranges from this table in order to create a second lighter workout during the week. So one of your workouts on both upper and lower body is going to be the maximal effort method, where you work up and max out on an exercise variation. However, the other day is the dynamic effort method, where you do speed work, where basically the whole point is that you try to get faster and stronger and develop your technique using the rep ranges from Prilipin's table. So you can see, as I said, Westside is really a combination of these three Eastern Bloc sources: the Bulgarian system, Russian Conjugate, and AS Prilipin's table. So as you can see, the construction and history of Westside is anything but simple. And in the rest of this video, I'm going to explain why I feel this odd mismatch of principles has been incorrectly applied to raw powerlifting. Alright, let's take a look at the actual Westside program. But before we do, I do want to note one thing. Westside is intended to be highly customized and individualized. No two people run Westside the same way. This makes the program incredibly difficult to actually review because there is no program, so to speak. That said, what we're going to do is focus on the general principles behind Westside rather than the specifics, in order that we can provide a good critical analysis of the program and ideology that goes behind it. Here's the generic version of Westside that floats around the internet. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, here is the generic version of Westside that I have constructed from the Westside Barbell Book of Methods. Now I know this is a little bit hard to see, so you're going to want to full screen this before I dive into the full explanation. So, during the week, you have a dynamic effort method day and a maximal method effort day for both the upper and lower body. The program is thus a 4 times per week upper-lower split. The dynamic effort bench days involve you using 50 to 60% of your raw max for 6 to 8 sets of 3. The dynamic effort lower body days involve you using 50 to 60% of your raw max for 10 to 12 sets of 2 on the box squat. Some versions also call for 6 to 10 sets of 1 rep on the deadlift using 60 to 85% of your max. Bands and chains are used to accommodate resistance and prevent you from slowing down near the top of the rep. Speed is supposed to be your guide here. You should be able to move the weight as fast as you can move the empty bar, but only when you apply your hardest effort. The dynamic effort work is periodized in 3-week waves. That is, you start at 50% for week 1, you go to 55% the next week, and then you finish with 60% on the 3rd week. For the 4th week, you repeat the cycle. On max effort method days, you work up to a max single on any variation of the bench press, squat, deadlift, or good morning on the respective upper and lower body days in the program. You should use a different variation every single week. Sometimes the book says every 2 weeks is okay. The goal is to work up to 90% plus. Generally, the protocol involves taking 1 rep at 90% of your PR, attempting to break your PR by a small margin on the next rep, and then taking perhaps 1 more rep if you feel you have an additional bigger PR. In this manner, each max effort method day is generally 2 to 3 reps at 90% plus. You'll notice that both days incorporate a ton of assistance and bodybuilding work. This is called the repetition method. This is where you're going to do things like reverse hypers, ab wheel, GHRs, and some of the other exercises that Westside has become famous for. Now, it's also worth noting that Westside often uses up to 10 extra workouts per week. These GPP, conditioning, mobility, and restorative work generally include things like massage, pushing the prowler, pulling a sled, face pulls, extra shoulder work, and anything you can think of that might improve overall GPP and work capacity. Because Westside was explicitly developed for powerlifting, it does include a comprehensive peaking plan. So, it's called the Circa Max phase. Let's take a look at what this looks like. So as you can see, the Circa Max phase begins 6 to 7 weeks out from the meet and replaces the usual dynamic effort method days. It's worth noting that the max effort method days are often decreased during Circa Max and substituted with things like heavy prowler pushes or heavy sled pulls. That's up to your own discretion. We're going to take a look at the squat as an example of the Circa Max phase. So using about 50% band tension in terms of your 1 rep max, the lifter spends 3 weeks doing doubles between 90 to 97%. This is incredibly taxing and difficult, but it prepares the lifter for the upcoming meet. As you can see, the final 3 weeks are a bit of a deload where the band tension is continually reduced until there's no bands at all in the final week of the peak. So, there you have it. There is the Westside Circa Max phase, and it's how you would peak for a meet using Westside. Now, in terms of periodization, Louis' original motivation for developing Westside came out of his frustration with traditional Western linear periodization. And for those of you guys who are not familiar with traditional Western periodization, essentially what it involves is you'll have 2 to 3 weeks working with, say, 10 reps. Then you'll have another 2 to 3 weeks working with, say, 8 reps, another 2 to 3 weeks with 5 reps, another 2 to 3 weeks with 3 reps, and so on and so forth until you get down to singles and you peak for a meet. Essentially, the whole entire periodization moves sequentially down the intensity spectrum. You're basically doing block periodization, where the beginning is focused on hypertrophy and the end is focused on strength. Now, Louis disliked this plan because you spend so long in hypertrophy using rep ranges that aren't really conducive to optimal strength gains. And that much is true. Spending so much time doing 10s and 8s isn't necessarily maximally productive for a powerlifter. However, Louis' biggest contention with this type of periodization was the fact that you weren't trying to improve all of the physical qualities simultaneously. Because there was periods of pretty heavy emphasis, he felt that it led to detraining of the other qualities. So as such, in Westside, there are days in each week where you focus on a specific quality. So you have the dynamic effort method, which focuses entirely on speed. Then you have the maximal effort method, which focuses entirely on max strength. And on both of those training days, you're also doing a lot of bodybuilding style high rep work called the repetition method, which is supposed to be aimed at hypertrophy. Now, Louis calls this mix of training methods conjugate periodization because you're training everything simultaneously. However, as we've already learned in this programming series, that already had a name, and the name is concurrent periodization. What Louis calls conjugate periodization is actually concurrent periodization. Real conjugate periodization is something invented by Yuri Verkhoshansky, and it involves an entirely different thing than what Westside is. For example, a really conjugated movement would be shooting a weighted basketball, so a basketball that's heavier than normal. And what this would do is literally simultaneously improve technique and strength. It's not really the same thing that Westside is doing because Westside is dedicating full days and different exercises to different purposes. So based on what we know about training organization, let's get into Westside a little bit more. Every single Westside training cycle is broken up into a 3-week wave on your speed work where you go from 50%, 55% to 60%. However, your maximal effort method day stays exactly the same. Not only that, but you drop the amount of sets you do as you increase the intensity from week to week. So what ends up happening on Westside is that your volume is exactly the same from week to week. So let's think about this. You have 2 different types of training within a week, and each week is pretty much the same as the last week. What do we have then? Well, what we have is a weekly mesocycle, right? With each session being an individual microcycle. What program does that remind you of? Well, if it reminded you of the Texas method, you're correct, because let's think about this. The Texas method also has a weekly mesocycle, right? With volume day being 1 microcycle, recovery day being another microcycle, and intensity day being the final microcycle of each weekly mesocycle. A lot of people don't think about it like this, but Westside uses the same programmatic structure as the Texas method because the dynamic effort method day is an entire microcycle, and the maximal effort method day is the other microcycle. And because the volume is held the same from week to week, you really have to say that each week on Westside is a full mesocycle. And as such, because Westside is using a weekly mesocycle, it's really most appropriate in terms of periodization for the early intermediate trainee. Now, all of this is incredibly ironic because the thing is, traditional Western periodization was developed because concurrent periodization stops working for advanced athletes. So what Louis actually did was take a step back to the model that was being used before Western periodization and added some new twists to it that nobody had seen before. Just because you're doing different exercises on every max effort method day doesn't change the fact that you're still using a basic weekly mesocycle and simple concurrent periodization. Remember, exercise selection and variation thereof is not the same thing as variation in intensity and volume. It's not the same thing as programming. So again, Westside, in terms of periodization, is actually best structured for the early intermediate, not the advanced lifter. The advanced lifter is going to need more variation from week to week. Westside has a reputation as a program that works best for lifters who are using performance-enhancing drugs. Now let's think about why the program would get a reputation like this. So first of all, why do advanced athletes ever move beyond concurrent periodization anyways? Isn't it better to develop all of your qualities simultaneously? Well, yeah, if you can, that would be ideal. But here's the problem. Recovery ability, although it does improve over a training career, does not improve at the same rate as the amount of volume that is needed to produce further adaptations. In other words, if an advanced athlete did the amount of volumes that it would take to improve hypertrophy, strength, and speed simultaneously, they would outstrip their recovery abilities and overtrain. So Western periodization was essentially developed in order to avoid overtraining. It allowed athletes to emphasize certain qualities at certain times so that they could improve them over the course of an entire season because they were just simply no longer capable of improving them all simultaneously. What is the alternative to these more complex periodization models? Well, the simple answer would be to improve your recovery ability so that you can handle more overall volume without overtraining in the first place. Now, how would you do that? Well, there's primarily two ways. You can improve volume tolerance and work capacity by, say, doing GPP workouts. And as we've already known, Westside often does up to 10 GPP workouts per week. So that's going to go a long ways towards allowing their lifters to use simple concurrent periodization for longer. But the other biggest factor that's going to improve recovery exponentially is introducing the element of performance-enhancing drugs. That is what they do. They allow you to recover from more overall work than you would be able to without them. So what this ends up doing is it ends up allowing genetically gifted lifters to use basic intermediate programming all the way to the highest levels of powerlifting simply because instead of having to do more advanced periodization models, they just increase their overall recovery ability by using the drugs. And in my opinion, this is why a lot of natural raw lifters have struggled with Westside. It just isn't an appropriate periodization for late stage intermediates and advanced powerlifters. You need variation as an advanced powerlifter from week to week. And Westside does not provide variation in terms of volume and intensity from week to week. It only provides variation in terms of exercise selection, and that is a secondary consideration behind volume and intensity. Okay, let's talk about programming specifically here. I've touched on it in the other sections so far, but now let's really narrow the focus. So, on Westside, even though you do not have variation from week to week in terms of volume and intensity, you do have a tremendous contrast from workout to workout. So let's compare the dynamic effort method day with the maximal effort method day using squats as an example. So let's say you're doing 50% on squats for 12 sets of 2 as per the dynamic effort method. Well, all we would do to calculate your volume is take 200 times 2 times 12. weight times set times reps. And that's going to give us 4,800 pounds of total volume. Now let's say during that week you decide to work up on the regular squat for the maximal effort method day. Well, your first lift might be at an estimated 90%, so you would do 365 pounds just because it's easy to load, right? So that's 365 at 90%. Then as per the Westside method, you would try to set a PR. Your PR is 400. So you would go for 405. Let's say you hit 405. So you get 405 for one, and then you feel like you had more left in the tank. So you also do another rep and get 410. But that's all you had that day. So this is a pretty typical max effort method day. You got 3 heavy singles in, and you've accomplished your goal for the day. You've gotten right in your rep range. Now, let's add up those poundages. 365 plus 405 plus 410 equals 1,180 pounds of total volume. So you can see that the maximal effort method day is 4 times less volume than the dynamic effort method day. What other program can you think of that uses a big contrast in volume early in the week versus intensity later in the week? Well, if you answer the Texas method, you're correct. The Texas method uses 5 sets of 5 squat on volume day and then only 1 heavy set of 5 on intensity day. And you can see that the similarities between Westside and Texas method in terms of programmatic structure are pretty striking. And it's not just volume, it's also intensity. On the maximal effort method day, all of the reps that you're doing in terms of working sets are above 90%. However, with the dynamic effort method, your reps are going to be below 60% plus whatever band or chain tension that you're adding to the bar. Though there is no variation from week to week, there certainly is variation from session to session, and that does make Westside appropriate for most intermediate trainees. In fact, if you're interested more about how to incorporate Westside principles into an intermediate program, Mark Ripito in the book Practical Programming spends at least 50 or 60 pages talking about how you can transition from the Texas method into Westside. He talks about how to basically modify the Texas method to become Westside. It's not something I would recommend, but Practical Programming is a great book, and if this is something you're interested in, I would give that section a read for sure. Now, I know I said that we were going to talk about the general principles of Westside rather than the specifics, but when discussing the topic of specificity, we kind of have to discuss the specifics. So in the original Westside programming, if you read the Westside Book of Methods, Louis repeatedly says you should only use the box squat. You should not free squat at all unless you're at a meet. Now, I know a lot of you guys are going to say, well, if you're a raw lifter, you don't have to follow that advice, but that's what's in the book. So we're going to talk about it because that's the version of the program that we're reviewing. We're reviewing the version from the Westside Barbell Book of Methods. I know everybody does it differently. I know you probably do it differently. But where is a new lifter going to get their information from, if not from the officially published book on the program by the man who created it himself? So using Louis' own words, you are not supposed to do free squats on Westside. And this is, of course, far too non-specific. As a raw lifter, technical mastery is one of the most important contributors to performance. How in the world are you going to master your technique if you're literally never doing free squats? And this same pattern presents itself on the bench and the deadlift as well. Throughout the Westside Barbell Book of Methods, Louis says that you should never pause the bench in training. Now, I'm sure a lot of you guys like to hear that because you like to stroke your ego with those touch and go benches. Don't lie to me, I know you do. But pause benching is required in powerlifting, and thus pause benching is more specific to powerlifting than touch and go. You should include both in your training, but you should never completely neglect the pause movement. I mean, pause benching is part of powerlifting competition. You cannot expect optimal results if you never use the version of the lift that you're actually going to do at the competition. It just lacks in specificity. Finally, Westside is probably the program that popularized the idea of increasing the deadlift without deadlifting. Now, again, I know a lot of you are going to say, the way that I do Westside, I include deadlifts. Well, if you read the Westside Barbell Book of Methods, They do not do deadlifts from the floor unless it's speed work, and they do that only sparingly. At Westside, the only variations of deadlifts that are done are from pins, are from deficits, and you're only doing these once every 3 weeks or so, if not even less than that. Because on the maximal effort method day, you rotate between a squat movement, a good morning, and a deadlift. So in reality, with Westside, you might only be pulling a heavy weight once every 2 to 4 weeks. Is that going to be optimal for technical development, especially since you're never doing the competition version of the movement? No. Is that just specific enough in general in terms of where you're getting your volume from? No. Westside has a huge problem, ironically, with specificity, even though it was explicitly designed for powerlifting. The next thing I want to talk about is the conjugate method and exercise selection. Now, the theory behind the conjugate method, as Louis calls it, because as I've already said, conjugate means something else originally, you are going to rotate through a variety of different exercises on maximal effort method days because you're trying to avoid the law of accommodation. For those of you who are unfamiliar, the law of accommodation states quite simply that the adaptive stimulus is decreased with each exposure to the same stimulus. In simple terms, if you do the same workout over and over again, it produces diminishing results over time. And this is absolutely the truth. However, that doesn't mean you have to take a completely extreme approach to avoid the law of accommodation. It simply means that you need to include intelligent variations throughout your programming. It doesn't mean that you completely eliminate the competition version of the movement and only use variations. That's just going too far. That actually almost eliminates specificity. It makes Westside more of a general physical preparation program because you're never actually doing the competition movements. As a raw lifter, if you follow a strict interpretation of Westside, you are never doing a free squat with a competition bar. You're never doing a paused bench with a competition bar. You are never deadlifting from the floor with a competition bar. That right there is the definition of lacking in specificity. Okay? So, I personally think that it's suboptimal to rotate your maximal effort method exercises every single week to the point where you're doing something new almost every time. The next issue that I want to address is bands and chains for raw lifters. Now, what is the point of bands and chains in the first place? Here's the thing, bands and chains provide accommodating resistance. And for those of you who don't really know what that means, let's break it down. During any lift, you're going to have what's commonly known as the sticking point. And the sticking point is the point in the range of motion where your mechanical leverages are the worst. It is the weak link in the chain, so to speak. You can only lift as much weight on a rep as you can get through your sticking point. Bands and chains actually change this. You can still load up enough weight to challenge your sticking point, but because bands and chains add resistance as the range of motion goes along, it makes the top of the rep harder and thus makes it so that you're not having an easy portion during the lift. Because the thing is that as you go through the end range of motion of a joint, it becomes easier and easier. Just for example, can you quarter squat more than you can half squat? Can you half squat more than you can full squat? Of course, right? Well, by adding bands and chains, you make it so that the whole range of motion is trained in a way that is difficult. This is all well and good, and in fact, for athletes, you really should be considering adding these types of things to your training. But what about a raw powerlifter? Here's the thing, a raw powerlifter does not have deficiencies, generally speaking, in the top half of the range of motion. The vast majority of raw powerlifters are weak at the bottom of the range of motion in all three lifts. The deadlift, that's why people round their back. The bench, that's why people get stuck a few inches off their chest with their arms basically parallel to the floor. And that is why people get stuck right out of the hole in the squat. Because as a raw lifter, you don't have a bench shirt or a squat suit or even sometimes knee wraps that offer support at the hardest part of the range of motion, which is the very bottom. So if anything, as a raw lifter, you want to focus on bottom end work and not top end work. And bands and chains really address top end or end of range of motion. And not only that, but they tend to change technique, especially bands. Bands lock you into a certain range of motion that's just a bit unnatural. If you've ever used them, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And what is the benefit for a raw lifter of doing the majority of your work with these tools? Well, it's really not a huge benefit at all because you're probably weak at the bottom anyways, and you don't need to be focusing on top end strength. Not only that, but it's altering your technique because you can't bench the same way against bands that you do with free weight. So we're decreasing specificity and we're not addressing an individual weakness when, as raw lifters, the majority of our work is done with bands and chains. You know what? I'm not saying that you should never use bands and chains as a raw lifter. That's absolutely the wrong idea to get here. What I am saying is that it shouldn't make up the majority of your training work, which in Westside it absolutely does, because the dynamic effort method is meant to be done with bands and chains. And the dynamic effort method just so happens to constitute about 80% of your working volume on the main lifts during the Westside program. So as a raw lifter, it's just not optimal to be doing so much volume with bands and chains and so little, if not any, with the regular competition varieties. The last issue with Westside in terms of specificity is really going to open a can of worms, and that is the use of the dynamic effort method just in general. Here's the thing, the idea behind the dynamic effort method is that you only have so long to complete a lift. So you should get it done as fast as possible before your body basically burns out and you're just done. Here's the problem with this theory. You have about 10 seconds before your body completely depletes its ATP storage. Have you ever seen somebody grind out a rep for 10 seconds and then thought to yourself, you know, if they would have had a little bit longer, they could have gotten it? Well, I don't know, maybe you have. So let's think about this even further. The point of the dynamic effort method is to increase something called rate of force development. Now, in a strength athlete, it's going to take about 3/10 to 4/10 of a second to reach maximal force production. So let's say you do something absolutely incredible and you double your rate of force production. Keep in mind that most athletes will never achieve a 100% improvement in rate of force development, even when they train for it. So let's say you improve it 100%, and now you can reach peak force in 0.1 to 0.2 seconds. Okay, so what did we actually accomplish? All you've done is bought yourself another 0.1 to 0.2 seconds to grind out the weight. So let me re-ask you that question. How many times have you seen somebody sit there and try to get a rep for 10 seconds, fail to get it, and then you thought to yourself, man, if they only had another 1/10 of a second, they for sure would have gotten that rep? I bet you it's never happened in your entire life. Now, the other claim that's made about the dynamic effort method is that by putting a sub-maximal weight on the bar and volitionally using maximal force, pushing as hard as you can generate the same force on the bar that you could if there was heavier weights on it. And this is just not true. Mike Teixeira has done an extensive amount of tests using a Tendo unit that show that if you put a sub-maximal weight on the bar, even with the intent to produce maximal force, you will naturally produce less force than when there is more weight on the bar. So the idea that you can use the dynamic effort method to train maximal strength without using maximal weights is just completely false. Now, you can train yourself to use more force more quickly with sub-maximal weights. It's never going to equal the force production that you get with an actual heavy weight on the bar. So what does that mean in terms of powerlifting? Well, in powerlifting, we're concerned with maximizing our force production. Not our rate of force production, but our overall force production. And if the dynamic effort method is not giving us more time to get the weights, and it's not really directly addressing our ability to increase force production, what exactly is it increasing in terms of powerlifting performance? I don't know. And in fact, I don't think it does anything particularly useful. So in my opinion, any program that has the vast majority of its volume coming from the dynamic effort method is not going to be optimal for powerlifting. It doesn't really matter how fast you are in powerlifting. It matters how much force you can produce. So for all of these reasons, in my opinion, Westside is just not specific enough to raw powerlifting. Personally, I would never recommend Westside to a raw powerlifter. I just don't think it's specific enough. Now, what we've already touched upon fatigue management in earlier sections of this video, I'm going to try and address it very succinctly in this section. Westside does not employ variation from week to week in terms of intensity and volume. Your volume is held constant from week to week, and so is your intensity. However, there is significant variation from session to session. As we've already noted, the dynamic effort method employs both lighter weights and much higher volumes than the maximal effort method, which employs very heavy weights and almost no volume. So in combination, what this means is that the Westside method of fatigue management is actually optimized for the early intermediate trainee who only needs variation from session to session and not from week to week. Also, Westside is divided into an upper-lower split, which only further enhances recovery. If you're only training your upper body twice a week and your lower body twice a week, you're getting at least 72 hours between all of your training sessions to recover. Very few people are going to have difficulty recovering on Westside because of the use of the upper-lower split in combination with the fact that the lighter weights on the dynamic effort method are fairly good for recovery. However, for advanced athletes, which is really what Westside is supposedly marketed to most of the time, I don't think this is appropriate. Advanced athletes need variation in volume from week to week. Advanced athletes cannot improve all of their physical attributes simultaneously. They need periodization. They need certain times where they emphasize hypertrophy, and other times where they emphasize strength, and other times where they emphasize speed. Unless you make some serious changes to the periodization used by Westside, in my opinion, it's just not appropriate for advanced athletes. Westside gets almost everything right in terms of individual differences. Lifters are encouraged to pick movements and exercises that address their particular weaknesses. Lifters are encouraged to auto-regulate their training loads on each training session. During the dynamic effort method day, you're only supposed to use as much weight as you can move quickly. This is auto-regulation. On the maximal effort method day, you work up to a PR, or you work up to what you can do that day. Again, this is also auto-regulation, because you're not going to keep going up if you don't feel you can get the weight. Now, Westside also, to a large degree, allows individuals to control their total volume through their use of assistance exercises. That's up to you as an individual lifter. However, the one area that Westside really fails at is auto-regulating work set volume. You're pretty much always doing the same volume on max effort method day. There is a rep range of between 2 to 4 reps or so, but that's not really enough to amount to anything significant. And on the dynamic effort method day, not only is there no regulation of volume, you actually are supposed to go out of your way to make sure that volume stays the same. So, as I've said a million times in this programming series thus far, it's just not appropriate to have everybody doing the same amount of volume. In fact, even the same person needs different levels of volume from session to session and week to week. If you're sick, you're going to need less volume than when you're healthy. If you only got 2 hours of sleep, you're going to need less volume than when you got 9 hours of sleep. If you ate a lot and gained a pound yesterday, you're going to be able to do more volume than you could when you ate at maintenance. And so on and so forth. You guys can think of your own examples. The bottom line is that volume needs to be auto-regulated in order to account for individual differences optimally. Overall, I think that the Westside Barbell Book of Methods is a fascinating read. I think Westside itself is fascinating. If you've never studied Westside in depth before, I guarantee that by reading the Westside Barbell Book of Methods, you will be exposed to training ideas that you have never seen anywhere else. There's some really cool stuff in there. The problem, at least for me, is that I don't think that most of it is directly relevant to increasing raw powerlifting performance. It's just not specific enough. Westside reminds me of Frankenstein. It's like Louis Simmons took the best parts from a whole bunch of different stuff and then sewed it up all together. And the end result is a giant monster instead of a coherent, optimal training system. Look, Westside just isn't specific enough to raw powerlifting. What raw powerlifter can optimize their squat technique without ever doing free squats? What raw powerlifter can get the best deadlift results without doing deadlifts? What raw powerlifter can build the biggest possible pause bench without doing any pause benches? What raw powerlifter is going to be able to have optimal technique on any lift when they don't do any free weight version of the competition movements pretty much ever? What raw powerlifter is going to benefit from pretty much never working in the 80 to 90% range? What raw powerlifter is going to benefit from getting faster in a sport that doesn't have a meaningful speed component? As you might have guessed, my answer to these questions is, well, they're not. And Westside is just not optimal for raw lifting. Look, as I stated to begin this review, I can't comment on what Louis is actually doing over at Westside Barbell. I can't comment on every variation of Westside. I can't comment on how you do Westside. All I can comment on is what is actually written in the Westside Barbell Book of Methods. And if you can't trust the official publication from the man who designed the program about how the program should be run, what source of information can you trust? Look, not only can you make endless adjustments to address some of these criticisms, but in Westside you're actively encouraged to make adjustments to the program so that it works best for you. But the bottom line here is that I'm critiquing the general principles behind Westside. This is the stuff that's in the Westside Barbell Book of Methods. It's the stuff that's espoused by Westside to the best of my knowledge. And if you change it, it might make the program more optimal for raw lifting, but you're also sort of straying from the original spirit of the program. And that's on you. I can't review every possible variation of Westside. It's just impossible. What we can say is that the generic version of Westside that floats around the internet is just not specific enough to be optimal for raw powerlifting. For reasons that I've already argued throughout this entire video, I highly recommend that you find another program besides Westside if you're a raw lifter who's interested in maximizing their powerlifting performance. Moving forward, next up on our list is a program that I think has been highly anticipated, and that is Shaco's numbered programs. So we're going to take a look at 29, 30, 31, and 32. Why those ones specifically? Because those were actually written to be run as a 16-week cycle. A lot of people don't know that. And we're going to get into that issue and a whole lot more about Shaco's numbered programs in the next video review. So if you're one of those endless amounts of people who've asked me about Shaco, you better come back and watch that video. Now, if you guys found this content interesting, informative, or entertaining, please like, share, and send it out into the interwebs for me. If you have any questions or comments for me, please feel free to drop by the Powerlifting2Win forums and I'll answer you personally. Subscribe if you haven't already. And don't forget to check out PowerliftingToWin.com for more great powerlifting information. Have a nice day.